It's a privilege to have with us Otis Moss III of Trinity Church, Chicago. You can read his bio. What I have come to deeply appreciate about Otis, and I know many of you have, is that he's a man who has a remarkable read of Scripture. He can take a text, maybe a text that you would never work with, and you can just sense that he's just invested his whole self in it. And then he'll read it with fresh eyes, and suddenly something will start to spark in your mind as you hear him giving his own translation of the text, and then launches into a sermon, and he's got the Word alive in today's world. And it's just, you have a wonderful gift, Otis, and we've been wanting to have you here for a long time, and what a joy it is for us, and God bless you. Thank you.
Well, it is a delight to have this opportunity to be able to share with you for this very special gathering, talking about preaching. I said to the workshop community that it was just a delight to always have the opportunity to be able to talk about preaching, especially to be in the number of so many amazing practitioners. Scott was in my class, and I told him that he's got to sign my book, and just really appreciate his work. And then Susan, Reverend Susan Sparks, a friend and just absolutely a gifted preacher, practitioner, stand-up comedian, writer, and all things artistic. We are just grateful for her work and her witness. And to you, Peter, and to the church family here. And the food that we just had, I just want to say thank God for the kitchen ministry and hospitality ministry. Any church where you can get skewered chicken along with veggie tacos and fish tacos and cheesecake is a church for me. And I just really appreciate all of the work and all of the volunteers who have been working to make this conference and gathering not only a success, but a place where we feel connected to each other. I want to, for a conversation today, to look at a passage of Scripture coming from Isaiah, the first chapter, verses 15 through 17. And if you have your Bible app or your Bible, you're more than welcome to look on. That I want to read from the NIV translation, and then also the OM3 translation. That is the Otis Moss III translation. That'll be out next year, edited by Peter Holmes, and we are thankful to God for that. But we begin with verse 15, and it reads this way, coming from Isaiah. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I'm not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn, another translation, to do the right thing. Chase after justice. Fight for the oppressed, and take up the cause of those who have been orphaned, and plead the case of women who have been impoverished because of men. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. I want to, just for the time that we have, to deal with this simple idea of punching holes in the darkness. There is a gentleman who is no longer living. His name was Reverend Billy Kyles. Reverend Billy Kyles, who was a child of the southern portion of the United States, known as Memphis, Tennessee. He served as pastor in a church there and worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. He was one of the few individuals who was there on April 4th in Tennessee when a shot rang out and took out what I would say was probably the greatest prophetic voice America has ever produced, that being Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it is Billy Kyle's. He felt that it was a tragic moment, but also a burdensome blessing that he was one of the individuals who was present at the assassination of Dr. King. And after the death in '68, whenever he had the opportunity to speak, and especially to young people, he always told the same story, because he felt that it had been engraved upon him, upon his very spirit, to be able to share a story to another generation that did not experience what he experienced. And so he would tell the story of not only Dr. King and his work, but he would tell the story of a young boy who refused to go to bed. He said that there was a young child who was staring out of his window. His father had told him it was time for bed, but he refused to get under the covers. The father came into the room and noticed that his son was looking out into the window. He said to his son, "Son, it's time to go to bed." But the son said, "Daddy, you got to come here. You have to see what I see. You have to witness what I'm witnessing right now." The father stepped into the room. He said, what are you talking about, son? He said, "There's a man out here who is punching holes in the darkness." And he stepped closer to the window, and he noticed that as they looked out of the window, that there was a man who was lighting lanterns in town. And it looked as if he was lighting up the darkness and punching holes into those dark moments. And the father recognized what his son had witnessed. And so as he was looking at this moment, he realized that his son was seeing something imaginatively that he had not seen. And it is Billy Kyle's who says that this is the role of the church, and this is the role of this young generation. I heard him say it. He said, "Your job is simply to punch holes in the darkness. That there will be those who will bring forth ideas that will cover up the light, but it is the role of the church to be able to punch holes." That we operate now where we see a world in need of revival, a pulpit in need of resurrection, and a people in need of restoration. The prophet Isaiah's word speaks to us today. They need not sit upon ancient parchment hidden in the dusty ruins of an age now gone, an ancient nation struggling to maintain her moral sensibility, and a pulpit wrestling with relevancy, and a people thirsty for spiritual vibrancy, a nation where religious ritual is practiced, but the meaning has been lost due to the compromises from ecclesiastical cowards who seek congruency with the political order. The priests decide to be priests and do not want to be prophets, because you can be a prophet and a priest. You can be priestly and be prophetic. But Isaiah is dealing with ministers, priests, who would rather keep quiet in the midst of all of the moral bankruptcy that was operating in this era. And the pulpit can be heard in Isaiah cheering for those in power, anointing politicians with theological justification for their immoral actions, instead of speaking truth to power. Whether you use the name Israel, or we replace Israel with Rome, and Rome, since I come from America, with America, no matter the name of the nation or empire, when prophets fail to speak, suffering is always the product. This nation that is dealing with leadership that is moving in the wrong direction. It's not analogous to another nation I know of that has a leader that is moving in the wrong direction. And the church has mostly been silent, mostly been quiet. Most evangelicals in the United States cheer everything that the current person who occupies public housing in Washington, D.C. says. Anything that is stated, it is lifted up. That we've now moved to a place where the moral compass has been skewed. And maybe, just maybe, there are demons that are lurking in the corners of democracy, and it will take several generations for us to be able to recover. And Frederick Douglass wrote in his autobiography something about the faith tradition that we call Christian. And we have to be careful about what we call Christian. Because a lot of it that we call Christian is not Christian, but just simply capitalism in Christian clothing. And it's Frederick Douglass who states that between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide, to receive one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be a friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore, Douglass says, hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. We are in the middle of an identity crisis. As people of faith, a generation has risen, thirsty for a faith that heals and a pulpit that offers tools to reset our moral compass toward a more beloved community. People are hungry for those willing to literally punch holes in the darkness. I'm reminded of a writer and also a preacher by the name of Dan Kimball. He has a book that he talks about millennials, and it borrows some of the information that was presented by the Barna Research Group. I paraphrase what he states, but he says that millennials love Jesus, but they can't stand the church. That they have great respect for the faith of Jesus, but they have real issue with people who are representing the person known as Christ. The church today seems to be in the same vein as Isaiah, that Israel is struggling with what is the purpose of their faith, that priests are now bowing down to kings, and it is the prophet who has to do the correction to remind those in faith traditions, those in Israel, that what your call is. Your call is not to the king, but your call is to those who are the disinherited. Your call is not to those in power, but to those who are vulnerable. That if you turn your head from this call, that you are literally turning your head upon God. The church today seems to be in the same manner, where we are dealing with people who have rituals but have no relationship, that there is a moral bankruptcy. And so if we are to come in contact with the Jesus, the dark-skinned Palestinian prophet committed to the poor, we must have a view very differently than the way in which the world is operating today. That is very interesting that Jesus is perceived among millennials in a very interesting way. However, Jesus is perceived as loving, inclusive, compassionate, a noble leader, an advocate for the poor, the homeless, the broken, and the bruised. Jesus is viewed as admirable and one who is affirming and is a paradigm for emulation. Jesus even rates high among those who are outside of the faith. Whether you're a secular or humanist, whether you're a Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, they see that there is a progressive element in reference to the life of Christ that develops and allows democracy to thrive. But what is peculiar, if you ask people about the church, they get a completely different answer. They do not have the same answer as seeing something that is affirming and positive but something that is also judgmental, hateful, racist, homophobic, prone to violence, corrupt, and a negative force creating barriers and supporting the worst attributes of human nature. That Jesus, the Son of God, the Word that becomes flesh, the incarnational activity of God's agape is seen as the bright and morning star, but the community of people who gather together, those of us who gather and claim Christ, we are viewed from those on the outside as those who are antithetical to the ideals of Christ. And I must say, as one who is an apologist for the Christian church, that I agree with what many of our millennial sisters and brothers state. That I have to be honest, as one who pastors, that at times the church gets on my last nerve. That we seem to be always focused on what is minor instead of what is major in our church. We had an experience not too long ago that transformed and changed the way people view things in reference to the church. Our church, Trinity United Church of Christ, along with several other churches within our city of Chicago, we banded together and decided that we want to do something about medical debt. As a matter of fact, we realized as we looked farther north in Canada, you all don't have the same issues that we have in reference to health care. But the number one reason that people go bankrupt in the U.S. is because of medical debt. And so what do? We partnered with a simple not-for-profit organization, RIP Medical Debt. And we were able to raise funds to be able to buy $5.3 million of medical debt, and we forgave that medical debt. Now, the critical thing, it is a joyous thing to say yes, but the fact that we live in a country where the number one reason that people go bankrupt is because they get ill and they cannot pay debt. But let me tell you this, we only raised $38,000, but we bought $5.3 million of debt. In other words, that somebody was profiting off those who had been broken and those who were attempting to survive as a result of trying to pay off their debt. There's something wrong in a nation where you can become a millionaire as you put other people out of their homes. It is a challenge. It is what is wrong in our world today. And if we are to build a new nation where hope lives down the street from democracy and mercy lives next door to grace, we, the purveyors of the word, the poets of the pulpit, the psalmist dares us to sing songs of Zion in the darkest night, even when strange fruit is the only food blooming in springtime on southern trees. We must offer a way to punch holes in the darkness and give light in the face of this democracy. Now I say to every preacher that this is a challenge because so often we become fearful when it comes to raising what I call prophetic issues from the pulpit. We are afraid what someone will say. We are afraid what someone might write, an anonymous note. And you are not a preacher if someone has never written you an anonymous note. That is really your baptism into preaching and into pastoring if you get a note and you don't know where it came from. But it is the role, if I may use an analogy that comes from sports, that you are the head coach on a particular team. And I had the opportunity for several years to coach girls basketball, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. It was the greatest experience of my life. My daughter was on that 6th, 7th, and 8th grade team. And coaching girls basketball is different from coaching boys. Boys think they know everything. They are always trying to imitate everything they've seen on television. But girls were very different because they were always encouraging each other when somebody misses a shot. But it was my job not to necessarily be their friend, but to be their coach. I had to show them the correct way to shoot. Had to show them the correct way to dribble, how to run off of a pick, how to play defense. And I must say, we were the baddest defensive team in the entire league. As a matter of fact, they went undefeated 6th, 7th, and 8th grade during that stint. But what was so interesting is that there were parents who would always engage and say that I need my child to have more touches from the ball. I said, now I appreciate what you're saying, but I'm the coach. And it's my job to teach your child all the different aspects and fundamentals. Our job is not winning, but our job is to create character. And even though the parent did not want to hear that their child was not Steph Curry, I had to tell the parent that your child is gifted in this area. I mention this because so often we forget that in this moment of being in the pulpit, that we are also called as head coaches to give the correct form for the congregation so that we can be able to handle the moral darkness that we step out into. And if we do a good job, and if we do what we are called to do, in the process, something can happen that is transformative. I'm reminded of what my son said when he was about 12. He also played basketball. He thought he was better than his sister, but some may beg to differ. But he was, at about 12, he would always ask me to come outside and watch him. He said, "Dad, look what I learned today. I learned the crossover that Steph Curry knows how to do. Look at this right here. This is similar to Allen Iverson. Can you see this, Dad? This is what Kawhi Leonard would do. I want to show you what Pascal Siakam could do. I'm not his height, but I want to be able to do what he does." And so as he's out there working, he said something that blew my mind. Even though he was only about 5'1", my son said at age 12, he said, "Dad, I got to tell you something. When my height catches up to my confidence, I'm going to be a bad man." And when our height as preachers will catch up to the confidence that God has in us, we will see transformation not only in our congregations, but in our community. That we are called to punch holes in the darkness. But the problem is that the church is in conflict with Christ, and we have become an empire church instead of a church that is focused on Christ. That is what millennials are saying. They are saying that we see a contradiction. We love Jesus, but we have issues with the church. And we want to see congruency because we want to see ministries that are not focused on where you sit, but who you serve. We are concerned about what is happening in the world. What does Christ say about this? I'm not concerned about who will be on this board, but I am concerned about those who are broken in the community. If you can show me this kind of ministry, then I am willing to connect with you. But part of the problem is that we have become an empire church. Now, I'm a lover of movies, and I love a series of films known as Star Wars. I love all of them, especially the earlier ones are the best ones, I believe, the older ones. But there's something interesting that when George Lucas created this film, these series of films, he was attempting to create a critique of the American empire. Now, what is interesting is that he viewed Darth Vader and the empire as symbolic of America. And he wanted to use the Jedis as an example of a priestly prophetic group that was speaking to the empire. Because he was influenced when he witnessed a preacher by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He saw him as a Jedi Knight in the midst of the empire. But the challenge and the problem is that we think that we are Jedi Knights as preachers, but don't realize that we have been working for the empire. That we have simply been empire or Sith Lords who want to be Jedis. And until we can make an admission that we are also part of the problem, that we are connected to part of the misery that happens in our world, we will never be able to effectively punch holes in the darkness. In America, one of the great challenges that is a part of the rule of the American system is something known as the racial contract. The racialized contract allows America to view everything through the lens of race. In the words of a poet, it says that America was never America to me. And this contract forces a myth into the national dialogue where we accept the way that we view certain human beings as outside of God's love. And the way that this contract affects families is that it seems to be in every aspect of our living in the U.S., to the point where every parent who has a black child must have a talk with them. The talk that every parent must have with their child, as I've had with my son and with my daughter, is the conversation of what will you do when you have an encounter with the police. Not when, not if, but when. And the kind of talk I literally had to write a letter to my own son to share with him that he held on to, that we ended up publishing at one point, but he gave a response to me. But I had to write a letter to my son, as every parent must do. I had to write to Elijah and say, what shall I tell you? Shall I tell you that your rights are protected and racism is a scourge now banished from society? Shall I tell you that in this country you are entitled to act and live as any other teenage boy, to dance playfully with minor mischief and to speak with a quick, immature tongue? Shall I tell you that your body is safe, your mind is valued, and your future is free? If I tell you these things, my son, my words will be perjury before God, an assault upon the memory of our ancestors. So today I must share with you a hard truth. The truth is, my son, is that you are not safe. You are not valued by certain others because of their persistent melanin phobia. There is nothing wrong with you, but there is something wrong with adults who cling to myths created to maintain power and control. You do not yet have the right to be a frolicking teenager like other children in our community, for your boisterous actions might be misconstrued as a fearful threat by others who refuse to remove the racialized lens from their eyes. We must dare reshape how we view Jesus if we are to engage the most persistent things that operate within our world. We must see Jesus in a very different way. And I'm a Jesus man. I love Jesus. He's my man. I love him. But we've got to see him, because when you see Jesus in a different viewpoint, it will change the way you preach. If you see Jesus as a dark-skinned Palestinian Jew who experienced stop and frisk policies, who lived under occupation, had a terrible public defender, knows what it's like to be incarcerated and brutalized by those called to serve and protect, you will see and preach differently. You will see the Word of God differently. And I say this, that a sanitized Jesus cannot cast one's heart in the direction of those who've been brutalized and will not stand with those who are undocumented. But a suffering Jesus, and not the sanitized one, is the one that will stand with those who are the most broken in our society. Jesus should make us uncomfortable. And if we live in a day and age where Jesus no longer makes you uncomfortable, we like the cute Jesus. We like to preach Jesus, but we don't like to preach what Jesus preached. Because when we preach what Jesus preached, you will get an anonymous letter. When you preach what Jesus preached, there will be someone who will be uncomfortable. But when you preach what Jesus preached, there will be transformation in our community. There must be a commitment to preach what Jesus preached. Preaching good news to the poor, setting captives free, setting at liberty those who've been incarcerated, those who have been broken. Preaching what Jesus preached. To be able to preach to a person who has been possessed by a myriad of demons and recognize that this person, when they are clothed and in their right mind, can be transformed. To preach what Jesus preached is in itself revolutionary, and a concept that we must enter into and re-enter into the conversation in our community. And if we are to preach this way, it is the way that Leonard Sweet says it. We must be willing to leave some blood on the pulpit. It is Leonard Sweet's mother, Mabel Boggs, who would always evaluate a preacher this way. If she heard someone who did a nice job but was just okay, she would say, he didn't leave any blood this morning on the pulpit. But if there was something that was transformative, where they put their heart and their mind and their spirit before the people, she would always say, he left a little blood on the pulpit. It is just like when Judy Garland, before she would ever sing, she would always say, before she would sing, before she would stand before people, she would say, it's time to give blood. We are called to be homiletical homophiliacs, and that we are called to leave a little blood on the pulpit every time we stand up before God and before the people. Give of ourselves and not be timid, and recognize that something happens in the midst of preaching that is transformative not only to us, but to those who are listening. Now, if in fact that the church is in conflict with Christ, that the religion that we practice is the problem, then we must recognize that our faith at the same time is the solution. That we must be willing, as I said in my workshop earlier, that we must be willing to become homiletical DJs. A good DJ is somebody who is not monocultural. A good DJ doesn't have just an ear for one type of music. A good DJ recognizes that there is something beautiful in a variety of sounds. And so if I am to be a good musician and a good DJ, I must bring together listening to different types of music consistently. One great DJ is a gentleman who plays for the Roots by the name of Questlove. And Questlove is a DJ, a tremendous DJ, but he said, when I heard him in an interview at Duke University, he said, in order for me to be a good DJ, I have to be willing to bring music into my space that I am not familiar with. And so what he did, he started collecting music around the world. He would collect Mumbai funk and Nigerian soul, Celtic folk songs and Afro-Brazilian jazz, Korean rock and Taiwanese gospel. He was always expanding his sonic vocabulary. And if preachers are to preach with power, we must step out of that which we are comfortable with and know that God is speaking not just through what we are comfortable with and our culture, but also through a variety of people. I call this the Creole method of preaching, or a jazz ethic of preaching. The homiletical method that means that you are influenced by a variety of flavors, whether Cajun, Creole, Mestizo, or mulatto, that there are a variety of ways that you must be able to ingest those things that do not necessarily come out of your direct experience. I said this in the workshop earlier, this is why women are better preachers. Now, some of the guys just flinched when I said that. But the reason is because when you are in a space where you can understand the margin and the center, you have the opportunity to be able to view the gospel from the underside and not just from top down. When you have been marginalized and have the opportunity to see things from the lens of those who are on the margin and those who are at the center, it gives you a broader breadth of the gospel. And if we are to become better preachers, we must be able to listen and hear those who come from the margin. And when we do this, something powerful and transformative will happen. It's not unlike the song Amazing Grace, one of the great songs of the hymn tradition. But people seem to forget the origin of that song because that song speaks so much of what the church can be. It is not the words that I speak of, that Newton, who is the writer of the words, but I found out that when you go to the Library of Congress in the United States, that you find out that it says, words by Newton, melody unknown. That Newton was a peddler in black flesh. He was an enslaver. He believed that certain people who'd been kissed by nature's son did not have full humanity within the sight of God. And he was willing to sell bodies. He was a trafficker in human flesh. The story goes that Newton was on his ship, and there was a storm that struck the ship, and as a result, that's when he wrote those words, saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. But that is not the entire story. There is another story that is told, especially from mouth to ear, by people of African descent, because it is the melody that is played in Amazing Grace that is different from every other melody within the hymn tradition, because it is an African melody. It is known as the pentatonic scale, using those 5 notes of the pentatonic tradition that is heavy within the African tradition. And the story goes is that it is not Newton's prayer and his call to God that stilled the storm, but there was a sound that was coming out from that particular ship. It was a sound of hums that were in the hull of the ship. And the sounds were so powerful that it made its way up to heaven. And an angel heard the sounds and tapped God on the shoulder and said to God, "You've got to hear these children sing." And God simply said, "Shh," and stilled the storm. And that's where Amazing Grace was born. Because Amazing Grace is one of the hymns that you cannot play Amazing Grace without the black keys. In other words, if you take away the black keys, you'll have grace, but it will not be amazing. But when the black and the white keys make the decision to play together, something different is created in the process that allows us to punch holes in the darkness. And I say to you today that in your preaching, bring some Amazing Grace into your preaching. Bring traditions that you normally would not bring into to the sonic resonance of your spirit. And in the process, you will hear new notes, and God will play new things in your life and in the life of the congregation. For there are those who are trying to extinguish the light of democracy. And for those who live in the southern portion of this northern America, that there is, it seems to be, those who are high on narcissism, their insecurity, and their arrogance. But we need preachers who are willing to be prophets in this age, who are willing to speak truth to power and say they will punch holes in the darkness. This is our call. For if this new generation of millennials are to connect with Christ, we must no longer be a church that is simply about ritual but no relationship, but we must preach not just Jesus, but we must preach what Jesus preached. And in the process, we will witness transformation. If we are courageous enough to be the homiletical DJs and draw from different traditions, we can begin to punch holes in the darkness. May God bless you, and may God keep you. Now, Pastor Holmes told me that I have a few minutes that I could do Q&A, which I enjoy, that we have some time. That if there are some questions, I will do my best to answer those questions. If I don't have the answer, Reverend Susan Sparks will answer those questions for me. But if you have any questions at this time, I will do my best to answer. Don't ask all at once, please. Yes.
Would you say again the name of the person who was present at Martin Luther?
Microphone, please.
She's asking for the name of the person who was present at Martin Luther King.
The name of the person who was present. His name was Reverend Billy Kyles. Reverend Billy Kyles. And he spent 50 years of his ministry telling the same story over and over again, making sure that young people knew about the death of Dr. King, but the work, and that they were called to punch holes in the darkness. There's another hand in the back, I think. No? Yes?
In your homiletical DJ, who are you listening to?
Oh, let's go. You want to know who's in my iPod? Who's in my iPod? All right. Who am I listening to? There is a wonderful young millennial preacher by the name of Raquel Gill. I enjoy listening to very much. She currently is the chaplain at Presbyterian College in South Carolina. tremendous job in terms of a young preacher. I think does an excellent job. I love listening to Dr. Teresa Fry Brown, who is at Emory. I actually bring her to Trinity, really not so anybody else can hear, just so I can hear her preach. I just really enjoy her preaching. There's a gentleman in Louisville, Kentucky, by the name of F. Bruce Williams, who is an incredible prophetic evangelical preacher. I mean, and preaches in a very Southern style, but incredibly creative. A good friend of mine I love to listen to is Howard John Wesley in Alexandria, Virginia, and another gentleman in Houston, Texas, Marcus Cosby, who I really enjoy listening to very much. And then, of course, there are the great elders who I listen to over and over again, one being my father. I listen to him on the phone, and I also listen to him when he's ever preaching. And then a gentleman who is a huge influence on me by the name of Dr. Charles Adams. I have a variety of his sermons and love listening to him. Some people like to read. I like to listen to Dr. Adams. He does a tremendous job. And then I'm always going back to somebody by the name of Frederick Douglass. I love Frederick Douglass. I'm a Douglassite. I think that he's probably one of the greatest, not just homileticians, but there is no one who is able to put together words the way Douglass did. And the reason I love him so much is that Douglass is like Stephen, because every time he spoke, he was not sure if it was going to be his last. Because every time he spoke, there was somebody waiting to assassinate him. And the fact that he could speak with such power in the midst of the possibility of death is utterly inspiring. And he never went to seminary, but has a greater theological understanding than anyone in the 1800s in reference to biblical knowledge and also theological knowledge. It's just a really extraordinary thing to read him and realize his story. And so I go back to Douglass a lot. I just love the poetry, the poetics in terms of how he structures his messages. Thank you for that question. I appreciate that.
Not sure if this is a question that I should ask or not, but or that you might like to answer. Do you find that you can, in where you are in life, in your church, in your community, do you find that you can preach to power and preach to those who are downtrodden? Do you have that opportunity?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One of the things about the African American tradition is the beauty of being able to speak on several levels. That there has never been much controversy about someone speaking about the powers that be. Because the unique thing in that African American tradition is we understand the margin and we can also see a lens in reference to the center. That's a powerful double entendre to have that opportunity. And then to be in a congregation where you have people who are in power and those who are powerless. So we have a very diverse congregation. I mentioned in the workshop where there's two deacons that they sit in front of me every Sunday, and it's such a beautiful thing to witness. We have one of the top lawyers in the city of Chicago sitting next to a former heroin addict, but they are both deacon when they come into the church. No one says attorney, and no one says heroin addict. They are deacon, and they are elevated with equality together and respected deeply. But everybody knows both of their stories. And the one who is the top lawyer thinks it's such an honor to serve with this deacon. He says, "You've overcome things I could never overcome. And so I'm honored to be able to serve communion with you." It's really a beautiful thing to witness when you have those things before you. Those who are deeply broken and those who have been privileged but don't want to admit their brokenness. And then those who are broken who know their brokenness. So those things are together in the congregation, and it's wonderful to be able to witness that.
Western Ontario, everybody's white. Everybody's white. And if I ask my people about serving the poor in the community, well, there's nobody poor in our community. I know that's not true, but we don't have the perspective that you have. And so I suppose we maybe have to go looking for it a bit, but we do have an opportunity to preach to power, I think, but not always an opportunity to preach to those who are
Well, I'm glad you
powerless.
raised that comment, because if you want to preach to power and to preach to those who are poor, take a mirror and have the congregation look at that mirror. Because they will see people who have privilege, and they will also see people who are broken. Because part of the challenge of power is that power will make you think that you're not broken, or you will hide your brokenness. There is a wonderful writer by the name of Richard Young. Is it Young, last name? Young? Yates, I'm sorry, Richard Yates, who wrote Revolutionary Road. They made it into a movie. Yates's idea was, I want to write about suburban life, but I also want to show the pain that is masked by the exterior. So he's always writing about what it starts off as well off, we good to go, leave it to Beaver. But soon as you get in the house, you find out that there's some domestic violence. Soon as you get in the house, you find out there's mental illness. Soon as you get in the house, you find out that there are children who have no relationship with their parents. And he says that we want to deal with the facade and the myth of suburban perfectionism, which is also destructive, what he says the idolatry around the idea of perfection and whiteness. And so Yates deals with that as a writer, and that's also what we're called to deal with from the pulpit. We have to chip away at the facade. People should not come to church just to be happy, but they should also come to church to be moved. I like the way that Frederick Buechner says it. Buechner says, when his child was in intensive care, tubes all in her body, they did not know she was going to survive. He said, I did not come to church to hear somebody tell me about the Hittites and the Jebusites. I came to church for somebody to bleed with me. I need somebody to bleed with me. And we've got to reclaim bleeding from the pulpit. That's what it means to punch holes in the darkness. Can you leave some blood up here? Because we do believe that blood is transformative. We love to use the blood language within the Christian tradition. So maybe we need to cut and allow ourselves to bleed through the pores of our spirit so that people know that we are authentic and vulnerable in the process.
Otis, thank you. Thank you very much, Otis. You've moved us, as always, and we look forward to this evening at 7 o'clock. We now have workshop number 2, and so I encourage you to make your way to your workshop. Some of the leaders I notice have already gone out, so otherwise I would introduce them all. But we're very, very grateful to our leaders, and we're grateful to you, Otis. Thank you. God bless you.